Hello everyone. For this presentation, we're going to be talking about the spinal tracts, therefore the sensory and the motor tracts within the central nervous system, and how there is an integration of the information that's arriving from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system, and the response of this stimulation that then leaves the central nervous system and has an effect on the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord has two main functions in maintaining homeostasis. The first one is action potential propagation, and the second one will be the integration of the information that's arriving at the spinal cord. Now, the white matter tracts in the spinal cord, they will serve as these highways or pathways for action potential propagation. And these action potentials can either be sensory or motor. If they're sensory, they will go towards the brain, passing by the spinal cord. If they're motor, they will leave the brain and pass through the spinal cord onto effector tissues, which can be either muscles or glands. And the gray matter of the spinal cord will receive and integrate this incoming and outgoing information. So let's look in the next few slides how this will occur. First, let's talk about the sensory tracts. One way that the spinal cord will promote homeostasis is by propagating the action potentials along these tracts. And these tracts will go all the way up from the spinal cord to specific regions in the brain. And the name of a tract often will indicate actually the position of the white matter, in addition to where it begins and ends. So for example, the anterior spinothalamic tract is telling me exactly that it's starting anteriorly, and it will go from the spine to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, it will then go to a specific area in the brain. Notice how the location of the axon terminal will come last in the name. So spinal for where it begins, thalamic where it will end. So always make sure to pay attention to the name, because the name will be able to tell you a lot about these tracts. Now remember that dorsal can also be called posterior, and anterior can also be called ventral. Therefore, action potentials from sensory receptors, they will propagate up the spinal cord to the brain along two main routes on each side, the dorsal columns and the spinothalamic tract. The dorsal columns, which can also be called posterior columns, they're going to be these tracts or pathways that will convey the action potential for touch, for example, pressure, vibration, and also proprioception. Remember that proprioception is basically the awareness of the positions and the movements of muscles, tendons, and joints. So it basically tells you where you are in space and time. And the spinothalamic tract will convey action potentials for sensing pain, temperature, itch, and tickle. Now the spinothalamic tract, it can be divided into two different tracts. We have what we call the anterior or ventral spinothalamic tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract. Basically, they're just originating in different areas of the spinal cord as it makes its way up to the brain. So the anterior will come out anteriorly on the spinal cord, and the lateral will come out laterally on the spinal cord, as we can see over here. Now, there are other tracts in the spinal cord that include spinocerebellar tracts, and these will go to the cerebellum, like the name says. So spinocerebellar tract goes from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. And these spinocerebellar tracts are going to be important because they will convey action potentials for proprioception as well. Here we have an example of the dorsal column, which can also be called the posterior column, and the spinothalamic tract. In this case, they're only showing the lateral spinothalamic tract as it's leaving laterally on the spinal cord, but there is also an anterior that will then leave anteriorly from the spinal cord. With regards to the dorsal column, it will have a pathway that's posterior on the spinal cord, as we can see right over there. So let's talk about the dorsal column first. We can see that we have a neuron or a neuronal cell body located in the dorsal root ganglion, represented here in red. As it comes into the spinal cord, notice how the axon continues on its pathway up all the way to the medulla oblongata, and in the medulla oblongata, it will synapse with a second neuron represented here in green. Now, the second neuron will then cross over to the other side of the spinal cord. This crossing over is called decussation, as it then travels up all the way to the thalamus, where it will synapse with a third neuron, which is represented here in purple. Now, the third neuron will then send the information to specific areas of the cerebral cortex depending on the type of information that's arriving. A little bit more information that we can add from what we have seen already is that this first neuron over here is considered to be a unipolar neuron or pseudo-unipolar neuron because, again, the cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion, so it's part of the peripheral nervous system. The second neuron, represented here in green, because the cell body is located already on the spinal cord, it's considered a multipolar neuron, and so is the third neuron, represented in purple. The other thing is when we're talking about specifically sensory neurons, notice again that we have three and they have specific names. They're called first order neuron, second order neuron, and third order neuron. And this is just for sensory neurons. Now, with regards to the spinal thalamic tracts, we will see that very similar to the dorsal column. So you're still going to have a first order neuron that will synapse with a second order neuron, but notice how the second order neuron is located at the same location where this first order neuron is entering the spinal cord. So the decussation occurs at the level of the spinal cord, and it continues up through the lateral tract. In this case, if it was an anterior tract, it would continue up anteriorly, but it will synapse again at the thalamus. So the second order neuron synapses with the third order neuron at the thalamus, very similar to the dorsal column, and then the axon will take the information to an area on the cerebral cortex, depending on the type of information. So for the tracts, what's important for you to understand is the name of the neurons. So we have first order neuron, second order neuron, and third order neuron. The first order neuron is a pseudo-unipolar or a unipolar because the cell body is located in the peripheral nervous system, represented here by the red neuron. The second and the third order neurons are a multipolar neuron because the cell body is located in the central nervous system. The other thing that is important for you to know, where the pathways are going, traveling through the spinal cord, which the name already says, so it's not that hard for you to remember. And the last thing that I need you to know is where do they decussate? Where do they cross over to the other side? So the dorsal column, like I said, the first order neuron does not cross over as soon as it enters, as it continues up all the way to the medulla oblongata, where it will synapse with the second order neuron and then cross over at the level of the medulla. And on the spinal thalamic tract, the decussation occurs at the level of the spinal cord. So the second order neuron is located right when the first order neuron enters. So it doesn't have to travel up to the medulla oblongata. And lastly, I can't forget to tell you guys that the second order neuron will always synapse with the third order neuron at the thalamus. So for all types of tracts that we're talking about, they will synapse at the thalamus. Now, the spinocerebellar tract is one that only has two neurons. It does not have three neurons. So it's just first order neuron and second order neuron, and they don't go to the thalamus. They go directly to the cerebellum. That's why it's called spinocerebellar tract. Now, where will this information arrive? Well, the information will arrive on the sensory cortex. So remember, this is your central sulcus. that divides the sensory cortex from the motor cortex. So because this is sensory information that's arriving on the cerebral cortex, then it will arrive in the blue area first. And then from there, it would spread out. Now, the axon of the third order neuron will then be located in several areas of the sensory cortex depending on where this information is coming from. And this representation is here in this image. This guy over here is what we call a homunculus, which is basically a cartoon that's representing the sensory areas that have the biggest input with regards to sensitivity. So notice how the homunculus has big lips because our lips are very sensitive. Notice how it has big hands because our hands are very sensitive. Notice how it has a little tiny trunk because we don't need a lot of sensation on our trunk. The hip as well, the leg as well. The feet are a little bit bigger than the leg because we don't need a lot of sensation in the leg, in the hip, for example, compared to the feet. So this is what we call a sensory homunculus, basically a representation of where we have more sensation compared to other areas of the body. Here we have the motor tracts. So the motor output to the skeletal muscles, they will travel down the spinal cord in two different types of descending pathways. We're going to have what we call the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. The direct motor pathway can be called the pyramidal pathway, which will include the lateral corticospinal, the ventral corticospinal, and the corticobulbar tracts. Now notice how now the name is opposite. So corticospinal tells us that this information is traveling from the cortex to the spinal cord. So it's opposite from the spinothalamic tract. And the corticobulbar will go from the cortex to the cranial nerves. And these nerves, they control the muscles of the face and neck that are going to be involved in facial expression, for example, mastication and swallowing, and even other motor functions. The indirect motor pathways, they're also referred to as the extrapyramidal pathways, and these will include the tectospinal, the vestibulospinal, the rubospinal, the lateral reticulospinal, and the medial reticulospinal tracts. And all these terms are going to be regions close to the brainstem. So the action potentials are going to start on the brain. They will travel to these regions in the brainstem, and they will cause this involuntary movements that will regulate, for example, posture, balance, and muscle tone. Now here we have a representation of what is happening in the motor pathway. So again, it will start in the cerebral cortex, and all these neurons, they are the ones that begin the action potential propagation. And these are called upper motor neurons. And notice how these upper motor neurons, most of them will come down all the way to the level of the brainstem, and it will decussate at this level over here before it reaches the spinal cord. And once it reaches the spinal cord, it will synapse with another neuron, which is called the lower motor neuron. So here we only have two neurons, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Now notice how most of the upper motor neurons will decussate, but there are few, like 10 to 15%, that will go straight down on the same side and then cross over and decussate at the level of the spinal cord, where it will synapse with the lower motor neuron. But it is true that most of the upper motor neuron, they do decussate before they reach the lower motor neuron. And the lower motor neuron will then synapse with a gland or a muscle to cause an action. Now, where will this motor function originate? Well, it will originate on the motor cortex, which is represented here in red, which is the area anterior to the central sulcus. And in the same way we had a sensory homunculus, now we have a motor homunculus. So notice how hands are also big. We do a lot of movements with our hands, but trunks, shoulders, they're actually not as big. Lips are big, tongue is big because we do a lot of movement with these areas.